My paper has got 5 parts. And in the first part, I will shortly present what will I do. Then I go through certain authors. When speaking about the liberal tradition of comprehending the concept of society, I will use 2 historical materialist interpretations of the liberal political philosophy. One was given by Michel Foucault in his course of lectures at Collège de France in the years of 1978 and 79. It was published in a book called The Birth of Biopolitics. The second interpretation was written by Ellen Maxine-Swood in her chapter on English Revolution in her book Liberty and Property, A Social History of Western Political Thought from the Renaissance to Enlightenment. Both historians of ideas, differently from Arendt, presupposed that ruling or domination is the core of politics. Within this paradigm, they both interpreted political ideas or ideas on legitimacy of ruling in the 17th and 19th century in the way of explaining them by interest struggles among various social classes. Both the authors conclude that the rising interests of capitalist bourgeoisie produced certain break in the tradition of political philosophy in that period of time, especially on the turn between 17th and 18th century. And this break happened by defining a new normative field of autonomy, of homo economicus, autonomous from interference by the government. This program of autonomy needed to be legitimized as an effective alternative to the program of sovereign power that had legitimized itself as the one who is able to guarantee order and security. The promoters of the new field of autonomy from the government had to describe it in a way that explained why the field was able to provide order, justice, and progress without the use of the government's repressive apparatus. The crucial mechanisms that create a spontaneous harmony of interests and activities were taken from the economic field. They were market, productivity, and economic growth. This field of a spontaneous economic order almost no more needed public authorities, and it was called civil society or society. Now let's go to Foucault. Foucault's cycle of lectures at Collège de France from 1978 to 79 discussed, among the others, the break in the principle of limiting the ruling that occurred at the turn from the 17th to the 18th century. His historical starting point was that there was an absolutist ruler having or wanting to have an absolute power, and there was a rise of an opposition against him that wanted to limit monarch's authority. This opposition was developing a political theoretical argumentation for that very purpose. Foucault found out that the counter-absolutism opposition in the 16th and 17th century was building its arguments by the use of a legal strategy. It was conceptualizing some supposed to be pre-state natural laws or natural rights that were set to limit the ruler's autocracy. An alternative legal type of opposition strategy developed theories on contracts that were supposed to constitute the sovereign authority. By the end of the 17th and in the 18th century, the opposition developed a different argumentation strategy. Its point was an appeal to the sovereign authority to limit itself by observing an economic dynamics among the subjects responsive to the ruler's moves. When the dynamics is unfavorable, for instance, when labor or capital are emigrating due to too high taxes or unworkable legal acts, etc., then the ruler or the government should realize that he has ruled too much and too excessively. And the measure of excessiveness of ruling within the new theoretic strategy was determined by the political economy. The objective of the sovereign power has always been an increase of states' power, and in this new normative framework, this was expressed in terms of states' welfare, what was inevitably connected to the growth of the population and of its life means. A wise ruler should thus observe the economic effects of his own ruling and self-limit himself when he realizes that he has ruled too much, and so he should avoid suppressing economic growth. Foucault named this new type of rationality in the art of ruling being liberalism. Within this rationality, the market has started to be as the place and mechanism of formation of the truth, while in the 17th century it was still comprehended to be a place of justice, where everybody was allowed to buy things under the same condition without privileges or discrimination, and where fair prices were formed due to transparency and where a strict public regulation prevented frauds. The establishment of the political economy, providing a normative measure against the excessive ruling by the government, opened the question, what should be the function of the public law, so forth. Foucault described two lines of answer to that question since the term from the 18th to the 19th century. They replicated the previous split between the legal and the economic strategy of limiting absolutism. He named the first way a Rousseauian one, according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. This line again started from defining some natural rights of everybody, which people are willing to hand over the sovereign only under certain circumstances in exchange for certain guarantees. This path led to democratic claims and also to justify a revolution in a case of rulers' break of the dealt conditions. Another way was an utilitarianistic one. It focused on the very ruling and on the limits to it put by the very facts. It produced a distinction between a sphere in which the government's ruling was proper and another one where it was more useful government not to involve in. The split between these two theoretical ways led into the shift in comprehending freedom. Within the first viewpoint, the freedom was the result of respecting certain fundamental rights, while within the second perspective, it meant independence from the rulers or autonomy. Within the second theoretical path, ruling was no more than a tactically self-restraint guiding the interests. And these interests were no more only the interests of the very state, but there was a complex of public and private, of collective and individual interests. A fictitious holder of this bunch of interests was called society. The society was supposed to be populated by subjects of self-interest, and Foucault called them homo economici, homo economicus. They were holders of will and choices that they were reproducing and spontaneously multiplying while following their own self-interests and being blind for the interest of the whole. The government's ruling should not put obstacles to them, but had to leave them to follow their own interests in order to maximize the economic growth of the society. The rationality of the government was not in making a view over the whole field of economic transaction, as nobody actually had such an overview. But its objective was, its proper strategy was to let homo economici be what they want to be, and in non-interference in the mechanisms of the market. In the last lecture of the course, Foucault articulated theoretical consequences of the presented bourgeois strategy of argument for the field of autonomy from government's interference. The consequence I'm interested here in is functionalist attributes of the concept of society. Homo economici, which settled the civil society, were committed to the dialectic of spontaneous multiplication. This was a quotation by Foucault, as you probably guessed. The government should make a note of this, and it should reconcile itself with not meddling in their private matters. Civil society is something corresponding to that technology of ruling, which should, in its rational measure, legally fit to economy in terms of the process of production and exchange. At the same time, Foucault comprehended the civil society to be a part of the modern technology of ruling, similarly to his understanding of phenomena of truth, knowledge, practice, discourse, subject, etc. So he comprehended these phenomena as being effects of the impersonal mechanism of forces which he called power. According to Foucault, the key shift for understanding characteristic and the mode of constituting the civil society was done from Locke's to Ferguson's conceptualizing of civil society. John Locke defined it through legal political structure connecting individuals in his second treatise of government written in 1690. And a little less than a century later, Ferguson, in Essay on the History of Civil Society, defined it as an automatic and continuous transhistoric anthropological endowment, which had been constituting itself spontaneously and without mediation by any sovereign authority or legal order. According to Ferguson, the civil society was reproducing itself as a spontaneous mechanism of interests, not only economic ones, and it was a spontaneous self-constituting with an unwritten social contract instead of a written legal constitution. The civil society had an effect of a spontaneous synthesis and spontaneous submission, as a spontaneous bond and spontaneous balance. These all were quotes. Governmentality came out of it, out of spontaneous arranging of people to submitted and dominating ones in function of division of labor in society, and it did not come from outside. The public authorities kept only the rule of a night guard sanctioning sporadic offenses. In all the other cases, the society was thought to be self-regulating and keeping an equilibrium among social relations. Society's crucial characteristic was this spontaneous self-regulating. And here was the argument for the interested claim against the government's non-interference in the society as the field of autonomy. Not only it would be counterproductive in slowing down the process of value production and economic growth, it was also not needed, as the society was ordering and managing itself alone. Now let's go on and watch how Alan Maxence Wood analyzed especially John Locke's political theory with the stress on his theory of ownership. Her two books of social history of the Western political philosophy were an interpretation of the development of political philosophical ideas and concepts from the ancient Greece to the Enlightenment as the result of struggles between groups having different class interests and sometimes also having ideological, especially religious beliefs in quarrel. She presented polemics between different ideas on ruling and on constraints to ruling as being in correlations with the opposites between exploiting classes and their different strategies of seizing surplus value in certain periods and lengths. The chapter on the English Revolution in her book Liberty and Property discusses the development of the English political philosophy in the 17th century period of civil wars between royalists and parliamentarists. Besides this front, which included also the struggle between political ideas of both parts, there was another confrontation. Non-owner classes mobilized in the Civil War from 1642 to 1651 started to articulate their own interested political theory and radical democratic claims. The parliamentarists soon crushed this people movement of levelers and diggers, but their political theoretic arguments remained, so that even such royalists like Hobbes had to refer to them and to turn them into anti-democratic conclusions. There were two key circumstances in the 16th century England. On one side, there was an agrarian capitalism being enforced by fencing and seizing common land and by throwing peasants out. The holder of these activities was nobility, transforming its mode of exploitation from feudal to the agrarian capitalist one, where management was oriented into production for the market and into improvement of agricultural land and increasing its yield. On the other side, there was a general balance of power between the king and the parliament. This balance was no more the old type of feudal division of power among different layers of competencies, even lapping over each other. The core of the new division of power was the division between the centralized king's authority on one side and the aristocracy focused on the new source of power, namely capitalized agricultural land on the other side. The aristocracy defended its interests related to the private property through the parliament. And the parliament was, of course, not a representative of non-owners' interests, but the members of the parliament represented themselves alone. There was a double rule by the king's sovereignty and by the nobility's property. The political exchange among these two power holders consisted in aristocracy leaving its traditional repressive competencies to the state, while the last was defending the private land property and entirely economic rights of exploitation for the demilitarization of nobles. There were occasional tensions within this cohabitation between the state and the nobility, but they always moved away in order to enable firm cooperation when the masses were entering the political space, what started in the 20th years of the 17th century. The masses were putting social and political claims into the public space. Their social claims were against fencing and for the old custom rights to use the land, while their political claims were related to expansion of the right to vote in favor of non-owners, or at least in favor of small owners. The political mobilization of non-owners reinforced when Cromwell mobilized them into the parliament's army during one of the sessions of the Civil War. A theoretical dilemma following this non-owners' entrance to the public space was about who constitutes the community of citizens or the sovereign people. Is it the ruling class in the parliament, or is it politically awaked people out of it? The parliamentarists were clear. The citizenship can be given to those only who have got means of self-sustain. On the other side, the radical wing with Thomas Rainsborough and Richard Overton developed the thesis on self-propriety over one's own body. Out of this, they derived the claims for the general and equal right to vote, the freedom of belief, the free access to the means of survival, which meant a denial of private property. And they also asserted that the main objective of the government should be maintaining person before maintaining property. But the conservative wing offered them only rule of law and a symbolic representation in the parliament. It suppressed the levelers, but Maxine-Wood says that after their theoretical innovation, the English political theory, its quotation, never again returned into the old tracks. The whole opus of political theory by Hobbes intended to block the participation of ordinary people in politics. The mass was said to be politically active only in the moment of establishing the civil society under the sovereign rule, and thus abandoned itself as a political actor in that very moment. Hobbes, in his work, De Cive, developed the idea of authorization. People were said to authorize the sovereign to act in their name from the moment of the establishment of the civil society on. He got the right to decide on their own about how he would keep peace and lives of the subjects. At this point, there was certain change in Leviathan. The subject's obligations end if the sovereign was no more able to provide peace and protection. Nevertheless, the essence of the theory of authorization was the statement that the subjects had given a permanent consent without being allowed to vote. A much different, although still anti-democratic theory was given by John Locke. His private interests were with agrarian as well as colonial capitalists, early capitalism of course. He shifted the political theory towards the business ethics. He opened the space for the liberal concept of society imagined as a condition in which people can cohabit peacefully and successfully almost without the government. He presented human's nature as much more positive than Hobbes did. For him, the main virtues were work, diligence, thrift, and reasonability. He used the leveler's premises, especially the premise of self-propriety, in order to argue against the absolute monarch, but without any leveling consequences, dangers for property, or threatening people's democracy. He blocked the claim for the right to vote, derived from the thesis about consent by the idea of a quiet consent. According to Maxine-Wood, Locke's crucial theory was the theory of ownership, which is actually a theory of seizing or privatization. The natural right to seize one's own products was deduced from the thesis of self-propriety. The same natural law limited the amount of seizing with how much one can consume, and with the regulation not to seize so many resources that the other people would lack potential to survive. But these limitations within the natural law were valid only in pre-monetary economy. The establishment of the money enabled individuals to seize more than they can immediately consume. The money also stimulates trade improvements and productivity growth. As these make increase in the common supplies of the humankind in comparison to the use of non-improved natural resources in the traditional economy, John Locke asserted that those who were able to improve or capitalize natural resources are allowed and may privatize huge estates because they were increasing the welfare of the others too. The last could be employed by the first, and they thus lived better than they alone were able to do in the traditional modes of production. The very ability of capitalization and accumulation of surplus value was giving the right to privatize the common resources as well as possessions of someone else, for instance, the native's land. The ability of accumulation also justified inequality in ownership if only the wage relations were based on a contract that can be terminated. The levelers wanted to secure small estates from big seizers and to separate wealth from political influence. The most radical among them even gave a theoretic priority of right to survive above the right of ownership. But Locke stood on a completely opposite interest viewpoint. He secured the ownership by basing it on a natural right, even if he conditioned it with historically new phenomenon of the capitalist competence. He offered to the non-owners living under the legal government and the symbolic representation in the parliament instead of their own political participation. He reduced the jurisdiction of the government to guaranteeing protection of the privatized property and right of free making contracts. In the historical context of primary accumulation of capital within the English agrarian capitalism and colonialism, Locke understood the civil society as a field of seizing legitimized by the capitalist competence and of trade that followed the distribution of property, including trade with labor force. The role of the government was to protect the ownership and not to restrict it with guarantees in favor of a more equal access of everybody to resources. Locke asserted that a just and efficient distribution of resources would be provided by the mechanisms of exchange within the new capitalist economy. He imagined the society as what we would today call the wild capitalism, perhaps especially in our part of Europe. What was the new reality of his contemporaneous. But we can estimate his thinking in the turned way too. The wild capitalism was the rising fact of Locke's period of time. What he did was to legitimize it by calling it the society, together with all the positive connotations of this term. It means that he attributed it with abilities of self-regulation, just distribution of resources, and thus spontaneous social harmony that did not need any governmental interventions. With such a normative interpretation of the capitalism, he not only depoliticized the class issue, but he also removed it from the horizon of the moral philosophy. The question of sufficient access to resources for everybody was done away with the belief in progress. This progress was run by the improvers, of course. The solution for a possible scarcity in capitalism was more capitalism. If we take such a notion of society in descriptive terms, it is clear that business is a very important content of it. But if we take it in normative terms, the positive connotations of social spontaneity and harmony play another role. It is the role of legitimizing the business and its historical preconditions of the primary accumulation. This heritage of such a comprehending of society have continued from the liberal political, or maybe better saying post-political philosophy, to various branches of bourgeois sociological theory, especially in the functionalism, as well as in Weber's stress on instrumental rationality as a more and more determining principle of acting in the modern era. Now let's go shortly to Hannah Arendt, and I will just repeat what I explained about her understanding of society, her using of this word in different texts of her. What I explained in the last year's seminar here or there in Dubrovnik. Hannah Arendt developed her critical concept of society while facing an abyss of evil that happened as a crystallization of different processes in the modernity. The list of them can be found in the table of contents in her major book, The Origins of Totalitarianism. As I presented it here in the last year's seminar, the concept of society consists of three meaning groups. First, it nominates status inequality, and it is related especially to the phenomenon of social climbing. Second, When she speaks about society or something being social, she's talking about conformist behavior, playing social roles, and taking socially prescribed identities. And the third, the capitalist economic system run by the imperative of the economic growth. Arendt's handling with these three meaning complexes was not descriptive but critical. The point is from which existentialist standpoint she thought about certain really existing phenomena marked as being social. From here on, one can understand her view on how people do their activities when these are social. When writing about the social inequality, there were several normative perspectives by Arendt. One was the perspective of political equality being disabled by impacts of social practices. The second one referred to the loss of one's personal self, original self-image, and authenticity of being, what was the price paid by social climbers due to their obsessive adjustment to the demanded social norms. The fourth one was the perspective of a possibility to ignore and to reject social rules. Arendt critically treated the problem of conformism from two viewpoints. The first one was integrated in her analysis of how social conformism in various historical episodes disabled politicization and struggle for recognition of political equality. The second one was the belief in a basic value of variety of forms of human living. This variety was limited in a mode of being determined by social conformism. And Arendt evaluated the economic socialization into the process of the capitalist reproduction from the perspectives of the variety of human activities and modes of being too. In the human condition, her major critique of social being within the cyclical process of economic reproduction claimed that it was an impoverished, a species-only being. Besides this, Arendt warned against the potential of superfluousness of whole groups of people as well as of natural environment and against their destroying when they were in the way of the process of the economic growth. Now, my final conclusions. We can overview now and estimate the common points and the differences in perspectives between Arendt's and the presented, of course, through materialist critique, liberal conceptualizations of society. I will expose also certain shortage in Arendt's theory, which enabled her to give more than only several general existentialist judgments on the economic core of the liberal concept of society. Arendt has for sure had much in common with practical claims by the liberal tradition of political thinking. It is the meaning of equal rights, the rule of law, limitation of government's power, freedom of speech, toleration, plurality, and so on. These institutional gains are the base of non-being subjugated to an oppression and of having an opportunity to live following what is worth of living for. But from this point on, we can start listing the differences between the two theoretical positions. The liberalism has appreciated private existence while Arendt did the public one. The liberalism has equated politics and the government and it has claimed for their limitation, while Arendt thought of politics as a practice of public acting, and she appreciated it as the supreme mode of existence, and she criticized those social conditions in which it was blocked. One of the differences in their estimations of the sphere of being is their estimations of the sphere of being called society. Both Arendt and liberalism understood it in a substantial scope as the field of capitalist economic processes. The difference was in their evaluation and in normative claims derived out of this evaluation. The liberal concept of society has described the capitalist economy as a self-managing stage of a harmonic cooperation. Its key claim, which is integrated in the very notion of society, is that the government should not interfere in the social economic life, and it should let it run itself autonomously by the market mechanisms. On the other hand, Arendt treated the social mode of activities serving the mechanism of the immense reproduction of capitalism being an existentialist problem. Her claim was for liberation of people from society in order to release their time for more senseful world-making activities as politics and art are. She also appealed for the condition in which every group and every human being should have a protection from losing one's place in the world, and therefore she opposed to the practice of capitalist creative destruction of the traditionally given roles and of natural environment, what sociology has been explaining by the so-called modernization. What is Arendt's shortage in her discussion, the economic dimension of the society, is that she did not develop any economic theory. This is the reason why she could not grasp the liberal imaginario about the society, which is a curtain before the class interest of bourgeoisie, differently from only giving some general existentialist judgments that could be even interpreted as being conservative and anti-modernist. If she has an economic theory, she would be able to research more in details, or at least she would have a more exact understanding of processes and effects by the capitalist economy. Arendt basically made two judgments about the capitalist society. The first one was that the capitalist social life was going on as a process, and all the processes presuppose reproductive sort of being, whether we speak about individual and species biological reproduction or about the reproduction of the very socio-economic system. Her second judgment was actually a warning against structural violence by the capitalist system against superfluous people and parts of the world. But Arendt did not, and probably was incapable of telling anything about mechanisms of generating income and property inequalities that have been pushing a huge part of the humankind into the lack of the basic goods. It was the same with the mechanism of the capitalist generating power asymmetry, which has been undermining a potential for political equality and equal participation in the public sphere. The sorts of inequality which she thematized in the origins of totalitarianism were more or less only symbolic status inequality and legal political inequality, but not the economic one. Meanwhile, in On Revolution, she failed in interpretation of the political meaning of the problem of a big economic inequality. She principally stood for constituting political equality, and she told in a small text that its precondition should be a relative equality of welfare. But she did not discuss whether this precondition had been met and why it had not been. She also did not take into account the paradox whether it makes sense to speak about political equality as a system if it is available only to the few, or it is more proper to name the situation an oligarchic republic. And finally, Arendt in On Revolution also did not show a sympathy for those who tried to put the fact or their welfare lack in the public space as its political topics. Because of misunderstanding of the economy and of generation of the economic inequality, Arendt could not grasp analytically the core of what the liberal political thinking idealistically described as civil society. And she was unable to expose the hypocrisy of this notion. On the contrary, one could blame her to have this blindness about the position of non-owner groups in common with the liberalism, even if there is the difference between them, whether one idealizes living of the elite in the public or in the private sphere. That's all.
Muchas gracias, caballero. You were excellent in 45 minutes.
And you, as a liberal, you were probably not very happy with some of my interpretations.
Of course I'm not happy, but I will attack you later. The floor is open for questions. Are there any questions in the room? People are still thinking about their questions in the room. So are there any questions by Zoom participants? Wolfgang, please unmute yourself, Wolfgang, you're muted.
Unmute yourself. Yeah, thank you very much. I have only a question. I see also the problem between, if we think about Hannah Arendt's Republic, which was founded in the United States, it was another form of economy, and the question of how can we politicize our society in the sense of community, and what do we need as reform of economy is a very open question. So I think it's very good that you start this way. My question is, there is civil society as a concept in Hegel and in civil society debate, and on the other side, Hannah Arendt's observation on democracy in the United States or in America. She writes about associations, apolitical associations and political associations. Political associations is something which could be described as civil society, but not in the sense of Hegel that there is a bourgeoisie and the parliament, and beside of this there is civil society. How do you see this? Is this an additional point, or you left it out because it's not so interesting?
Okay. I think you put two questions. One was about the United States, and the sub-question of associations is a part of this. And another one is Hegel's comprehension of civil society. When we speak about the United States, we should not ignore the very historical fact that this society, economy, this world, whatever you describe it, was established on the blood of native population and of black slaves. It has always been a racist society, and it still has certain problems with this. In America, relative equality of well-being for the white people, for the white men, maybe also to stress, was based on enslaving, stealing land, making genocide over the native population, and on importing of the black slaves, and later also of importing the very poor immigrant laborers. So I think we cannot just say what is American imaginario, that America was an empty land where everybody has got, from the God, of course, equal opportunities to build his own business due to his diligence, his work, his knowledge, etc. Because there were certain very unjust economic processes that were a precondition of the whole story. And it is not surprising that also the American political system, when it was established as a democracy, was reduced only to actually this privileged white male population. So in a kind, it's a repeat of the economic precondition of the ancient Greek democracies. So, you know, if you're a white American, you may be okay with this, and you just don't want to know anything about the history of your land. But if you belong to the suppressed or to the destroyed groups of people, then the situation with the American political and economic and social system is seen differently. Now Hegel's understanding of civil society goes in line with the liberal, and he's quite clear about this. I mean, he's quite clear about saying that civil society is the field of business, private freeing, making contracts, etc., making some deals. But for Hegel, it is not enough. He claims also for an umbrella system that provides universality and actualization of the spirit of the history, of the historical process, and he put this function into the state, actually. So civil society is important for getting means of survival, etc., but it cannot be alone because it has no universality dimension. This is Hegel's point. So Hegel is a kind of a critic of liberal supposition that civil society can be self-sustainable.
Self-regulative.
Yes, also self-regulative.
I would like to Yes, hello.
Hello.
Hello, nice to see you, nice to hear you. Thank you for your presentation. I have a small difficulty, I guess. And that is the distinction Hannah Arendt makes between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. I think this distinction is important to keep in mind when you discuss her insistence about distinguishing society from politics, or the social realm from the political realm. And I think what she is somehow occupied with is to find a way how to conceptualize or how to make it possible that the experience of freedom is possible and can be guaranteed. And at the same time can be somehow coexistent with the experience with equality under the conditions of the 20th century. So she somehow takes from the three main somehow mottos of the French Revolution, equality, freedom, and brotherhood, the two first, equality and freedom. She's critical about brotherhood, but this is another topic. So, and then she, I think then her point is that she sees a danger or a problem, not only a danger, but also a problem, where to somehow find, where to situate the possibility of experiencing freedom. Because it, according to Arendt, it is not possible in the realm of necessity. And at the same time, she notices that somehow the logic of the realm of necessity, which is the logic of means and ends, grows over and covers, tends also to cover the realm of politics, where freedom should be, where there should be the possibility of experiencing freedom. and somehow this contradicts, because the logic of means and ends does not coincide with Hannah Arendt's understanding of acting, because to action and acting is related unpredictability, openness. It cannot be planned. So I somehow cannot see how this way, or her way of approaching the task, how to guarantee the experience of freedom, somehow finds place in your conclusions.
Thank you, Helga, for your question, but I don't agree with your conclusions.
I can imagine, yes.
What is important is to think about what does it mean, what you called experiencing freedom. Is it a state, a position, a condition in which we live in, or it is a very practice that we do? These are two possible understandings of experience of freedom. And so I think that my observation that Arendt was a little bit blind, especially on revolution, on the economic preconditions for such a living standard in which people have time enough to act and are not feared of being oppressed, etc. My point, I mean, there is certain point. My second answer to your observation, to your question, will be this. You say that when people act, the logic of means and ends doesn't work.
I didn't say that.
Yeah, but we should divide between two things. One is why people start to act, why they go into action, and another question is what would be the result of action.
You never know.
You never know, but you never know because there are also other actors, because the political situation is plural. But still, you can have certain objectives because of, and you decide to go into action to get to these objectives. For instance, your objective can be to improve your social condition. Your objective can be to fight against racism or against gender inequality, etc. And this is, I mean, you have certain goal you try to achieve in political action. But then when political action is going on, the situation is unpredictable and the result is not completely under your control. Yeah, so I believe that within politics, there is also lots of room for opening various social problems. And political movements like trade unionist movement, feminist movement, LGBT movement, etc. They go into politics, they start to be active because of certain social goals they want to achieve.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, but can I answer to that?
Okay, please.
Yeah, but that was not my point. My point somehow was that, or maybe I should make it more explicit, Hannah Arendt, she was not a social scientist. So we have to keep that in mind. I mean, I don't want to go into her criticism of social science, of sociology and social scientists at her time, but it has something to do with her methodology or her way of thinking that she was not a sociologist or a social theorist. She was well, I would say she was a philosopher in a certain way. She was, I mean, she was, she was, as we all know, educated with the professors Heidegger and Jaspers. She had an approach. She approached the political life as phenomena, and she had some. So what I try to say, I think, is it's somehow her way of thinking is not. It is different from social scientists. So of course one can criticize her that she, and people do that she makes this distinction between social and political, but once one looks into it, why she makes this decision and why this decision is so important in her way of trying to rethink the political is because she it's important for her to after the experiences of the disaster of the Second World War and totalitarianism and the Holocaust, to give it all space. I mean, to think in such a way that there would be space for not thinking of politics as a disaster, as violence, as war related to these negative moments, but as a way as a dimension of our lives, the only dimension, in fact, where we can experience freedom. And therefore this distinction is so important for her, the distinction between necessity and freedom. But I guess I'm going to repeat myself, sorry.
Well, I think that, yes, I agree with you that the experience of Holocaust was the key event out of which she developed the distinction between politics and social processes. But I think that her message to the victims and to the perpetrators and to those who just observed the process of destroying the whole nations within Europe was not that they should engage against these tendencies in order to become a part of historical narrative, to gain certain permanent living, to gain freedom, an abstract freedom. Her message, because of which she renewed the concept of political action, reading Greeks, etc., was the message that something could be done. People involved in the process of Holocaust had an opportunity to stop the situation, at least a little bit, at least make a little difference. And that was her point, her basic point. Do not look at what is going on as a necessary social process, because in every situation you've got certain responsibility to act against the situation, if of course you feel that something is going wrong with your basic interests or with justice or something else. So the point of the whole theory that followed her book on the totalitarianism is that those involved into the process of Holocaust should try to stop the process, should try to act in order to keep lives. And this is a very, very, I would say, utilitarian reason for action. To protect your own life or your neighbor's life. This would be the reason why to go into action. This is my understanding. So her claim for action is not on an abstract purpose. It can be on a very lively, everyday purposes that are legitimate. It's just a question of how we take, how we see the whole situation in the world. Is it possible to change anything or not?
Well, directly to that, I think you have a far too optimistic understanding of action. Action is a gift, according to Arendt, as I read her and remember her, that is a dangerous gift.
Excuse
Don't
me,
forget that.
we have a few questions. This is turning into a dialogue.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry. I would like to continue. Last, please.
Yeah, Gorazd, thank you. I actually have a comment because during your paper, I was like, when you said, okay, I mean, when you came to this point and when you said Arendt didn't have economic theory, no economic theory in Arendt, so she couldn't, misunderstanding of economy, you even said, and then this is why she couldn't explain inequalities. At first I thought, oh, that's excellent, actually. So it's a very good conclusion from what you've been doing on her concept of society, because then you somehow separate. So those ones who are saying Arendt doesn't understand society, you say are not right, actually, because she does explain a very important things that are about the society and the problems of society and about the concept of society. What is missing there, basically, is that she does not ask economic questions in terms of what is causing economic inequalities, basically, I would say. So she doesn't tackle the process of production, you even said, I think. And then I was thinking, is this the solution, you know? Is this right, actually? And because then we would have to make a step further again and say, I mean, she didn't have a concept of a class society, and basically, she didn't do what Marx already did. So it's a somehow regressionist argument, I would say. I mean, I don't have a better term. So I was thinking, and you know, okay, but then, okay, she doesn't have a concept, but then, I mean, there are these screams, passages, you know, when she's asked about, you know, what do you think about, you know, how would you solve the problem of inequality? And then at certain point, she says that's a technical question, and you know, we've been discussing this already. This is one point. And the second thing that she does, she says, it's all about distribution. So that's about the technical question. It's not when she says it's not a question of politics, it's about the question of technically solving the question of inequality. And then what she says, basically, if children in school do not have breakfast, we should give them all breakfast. So to the certain extent, I would claim, but this is my claim, I mean, I'm making it bigger than it is in reality. My conclusion that she is basically arguing for a basic income society. So we should have a basic income, everybody should have basic needs. And this is, you know, what some other philosophers, you know, are suggesting. Yeah, exactly. So, and then, you know, we can play with everything else. So this is one point, and I don't want to be too long. I'm asking myself, you know, if today's inequalities are really, if we go back to Marx, are really the result of the process of production. I don't think they are. I don't think they are economic. We have this intersection of different causes of inequalities which are not purely economic. So we cannot solve this with economic theory, I think. And that's my thought. It's undeveloped. This is what came into my mind when I was listening to you and first thinking, oh, that's excellent, that's brilliant, because no one has said Arendt doesn't have economic theory yet. You are the first one that I've heard to say something like that.
It is so obvious.
So congratulations. I mean, it's a very good point.
There is no sentence about understanding economy in the whole 900 pages of the Origins.
Yeah, I mean, I really love this argument. I really love it. So.
Gorazd, please respond.
Yes. In fact, Arendt wrote in a note somewhere on revolution, I think, I'm not sure, that if children are hungry, then it's a technical question how to provide them with, I don't know, lunch in school, etc. But actually, it's never so simple, because someone has to pay these welfare services. And those who are rich will oppose increasing taxes. So you have a kind of, political struggle about the level of taxation, about how the government should and is allowed to make public expenditures for army only or also for welfare, etc., etc. And what I'm saying is only that these questions where we hit different class interests are also a part of the political stage. That's all. They also can be a content of politics, and they are. Let's be realistic, please.
Okay, we have another question.
It's not really a question, it's more of an observation that, Arendt did not specifically, and I agree with you, Gorazd, have economic theory, but she did tackle some really important issues of economic, that is class society, like private property in Vita Activa and of consumerism. So one can develop further your argument and like take this, okay, she did see there's a problem, but let's take it further and make it more explicit. That's all.
Well, she was writing something about, yes, consumerism in Vita Activa, but I think it's more moral sentences than an economic analysis. So I'm still on my observation that she unfortunately hasn't developed an economic theory, and it made her certain shortage in her analysis of different modern phenomena.
Boris, I would just say one more sentence, because I mean, if talking about concepts, then if we are switching from society to economy, and we are discussing the concept of society first, then we should now discuss the concept of economy again. So you know what I mean with this. Because now
these concepts go together. They were developed together.
Yeah, exactly. So, we cannot solve the problem with replacing one concept with another, which is not yet explained. So we have to think within this Gorazd, what do you say? Cluster of concepts. Yeah. They basically just.
Yes. I mean, when we speak about the concepts, it's clear. My thesis was that the idea of something like society is a normative side of the coin called economy, concept of economy. It's a normative, positive representation of what is the idea of economy. But I'm saying also that there is certain really existing economic realm that is an important force in our modern world. And we should understand it. That's all.
Yeah.
Okay, I don't see any further questions in the room. I see Yernea on the Zoom.
Me too.
Yeah, we should.
Gorazd, do you think that Hannah Arendt's political theory will be much different if she would develop economic theory would be better because developing economic theory, or isn't the value of her political theory especially because she didn't develop economic theory?
If we divide between political theory and political historic analysis, I would say that her political theory would not be much different, but her historical analysis, which are, on my opinion, very interesting readings, would be better. I prefer reading, for instance, her short writings on the Jewish question or the origins. And I think that these writings are more inspirative than, for instance, the human condition. But it's maybe my personal prejudice.
Okay, I don't see any further questions either on Zoom or in the room, so I can now pose a few questions at the end, because I really, I disagree with your argument more or less 100%. First, I think that you made a methodological decision in the beginning of the paper, and of course, you know, when you do political theory, then you can do more or less whatever you want. So what you decided to do is to reconstruct the liberal understanding of society without ever presenting any liberal understanding of society. So you use two authors who are not liberals, who wrote books of what they think that liberal understanding of society is, which is legitimate. But this is exactly how I learned about liberalism. And I'm 57 years old, in former Yugoslavia. So liberalism was always dramatically misrepresenting, but deriving it from John Locke, as if John Locke is the godfather of liberalism. Well, John Locke is a distinguished English philosopher who philosophized 100 years before the liberalism as we know it, actually historical stuff. So I understand why John Locke is important. And I really like the way in which you played with Locke, Hobbes and everything. So your paper is technically speaking beautiful, but dead wrong altogether. And I will use it once when it's published. I will use it to analyze it with my students. And I will say, well, this is how you can interpret liberalism. If you interpret it from a certain paradigm, without ever going into a deep criticism of liberalism from within. And I will give you an example immediately. John Locke does that in the first treatise on government. He doesn't attack Filmer from liberal position, which you call it. He attacks him from theological position, from within. This is what you never do. There isn't a single understanding of liberal society. And of course, because I don't have all the time in the world, I will not give you three different liberal distinguished understandings of what liberal society is. And they differ from each other 100%. And they directly clash. So if you think what liberal society is for John Maynard Keynes, or what liberal society is for Hayek, there are two different liberal concepts of what a society is. And they hate each other's guts. You have policy recommendations which come from one and policy recommendations which come from another. That's like heaven and hell. For me, and I'm not attacking you as a liberal, I'm attacking you as a political scientist. So this is what we do to recognize distinctions which are derived from different liberal understanding of society. That's one thing. The other thing, and now I'm not a liberal, I'm a pure political scientist now. Last week, I was presenting a book which deals with liberalism. by a distinguished Croatian liberal, Bože Kovačič. And I presented that book and read Sargentini report, which is, as you know, European Union's attack on Hungary. In Sargentini report, you have 13 violations. And all 13 violations are independent media, the state of constitution, constitutional state, the rule of law, protection of minorities, Roma and Jews, attack on gender studies, attack on institutions like colleges and universities. All of them are attack on liberalism. Not a single one is attack of what you called liberal society. Not a single violation of market system. Not a single violation of property rights. Not a single violation of any of the aspects of a capitalist mode of production. So if you do what you do, then you cannot say, how do we know that a certain state is liberal? Because you have market-based societies and ordered market-based societies in 150 countries on planet Earth at the moment by 3.5 standards. And you have fully functioning liberal democracies, between 25 and 30, that depends. Which means that you have regulated market economies at least 120 states, which cannot be called liberal by any stretch of imagination. This is the problem which you methodologically get when you write a paper in which you wrote. This is my question. Actually, a comment to the few questions.
Thank you. My first answer is that you are methodologically right, and it's clear that I opened the topic which is so wide that I should write a book, not only to have a short presentation reduced in 45 minutes. I can just say that at the very beginning, I told clearly that what I will tell about the so-called liberalism is taken from a historical materialist, two critiques of certain field of political thinking and certain authors like Locke, Hobbes, Ferguson, etc. But of course, if I wanted to go into finest distinctions within the very liberalism, into discussions among different liberalisms, it's a 10 years long project. Your second observation on the case of Orban's anti-liberal regime, which is anti-liberal as regards everyday life, freedom of speech, freedom of press, etc., and is not anti-capitalist. This observation is, I mean, you are right. You're right. Of course, there are also questions of how can it happen that economic liberalism can somehow turn into political illiberalism. And Orban is not the first case in history. There were many cases. Hitler is one of the cases, for instance. He was working for big businesses and protecting their profits. Pinochet in Chile is another case, etc., etc., etc. Maybe also the contemporary Chinese regime. It's promoting capitalist growth in combination with very illiberal treatment of their own citizens. But I will not open these topics because these topics is another, you know, big question for hours and hours of discussion. If
liberal state.
Pardon? Vlasta says liberal society against liberal state.
That's right. That's an interesting distinction. Yes. The question is, while the holders of the interests within liberal society can somehow be immune to the change of liberal state into illiberal state. So I can turn the ball to your side. But we will not stop then.
Gorazd, thank you very much. I enjoyed your paper.
Thanks to you and your comments, to all of you.